banquet guests. The banquet had begun with a bang, a grand welcoming, a grand hello, as it were, and it delighted Refo ever so minimally, somehow. Surprised he was, and greatly so, and as he had not expected such a warm welcoming, and had never received one. Perhaps this was something sad, or perhaps not. It did not matter. Refo was here now, and he would enjoy it surely alongside his father, who smiled with, could that be what Refo suspected it to be? Was that pride he saw gleaming in his father's eye, etched across his face with his father's also rare and beaming grin? Perhaps it was, and again looking every guest in the face at once, he too beamed with pride. So much so that when his father began to explain and disperse the plans for his company, for their company, Refo found the courage to speak. And speak he did to everyone who attended. Everyone boisterously, cunningly. There were 14 guests, some familiar, some more obscure. Of course, it did not matter what Refo thought of them, however. Each individual, as it were, was his father's company and his father's banquet. And it was his father's banquet. The first guest, the nearest guest, his name was Lukash, an important guest, though perhaps not the most important of the party. His history was an obscure one, but it was said that he was an orphan. He never spoke of it, and no one bothered him by asking, as that would be impotently impolite, as Refo's mother used to put it. Refo had, however, figured that he must have told someone of his past. Luca and his mannerisms, of course, were that of an orphan. Or, to put it plainly, he was quite evidently, or rather had quite evidently been an orphan, which perhaps all save Refo and perhaps his father had neglected to notice. It was not an obvious thing, really, but no matter, as Refo had more pressing matters to attend to here, as his father continued to talk to the other guests, in particular, as mentioned momentarily. Of the other 12 guests, 6 others remained yet more pertinent, and the others more obscure. Painstakingly so was it obvious to Refo who the key players, the most influential people of the group, were at this little dinner party, this small banquet which he had ever so loathed, despite his welcoming. First of the 6, of course, was a woman, Beatrice of the clouds, and that was her name, and like the clouds, her resting disposition was gray, as was her expression, a permanent frown, though she was yet quite young and quite beautiful, with black hair that normally fell down past her shoulders normally, though not this night, as it was tied into a tidy, neat, calculated bun. She obviously wanted to be taken seriously, and she would be. She was perhaps the third most important or prevalent of the guests. Her work, stonework, her father's business, the hard stone company, her father who had died when she was but a girl, unfortunately. Second of the 6 was Oscuro. That was his family name, Vray Oscuro. A beast of a man in size, although somewhat fat, and a lover of fine wines and food and drink. In general, he, of course, owned a company that distributed wine and ale, and any sort of spirits. He ate much, Refo noted. Too much, but he was an ally, as many pubs needed constructed in order that he supply them, and so he often gave the Rocumulus family, to put it modestly, sizable sums of money. And of course, each party did benefit, and so once more an ally he indeed was, and his company, Oscuro Wines. Third of the 6 was Denison of Lorcia, who had a family name, Drigg, but which he never used, at least not in the Shire. He was a member of the Lesser Parliament, quite the feat to have accomplished, of Undra, wherein lay the cities of Leshire, Refo City, Lesai, and others. His title was, of course, the Conductor of Commerce, and he was in attendance for an obvious reason, to keep track and on record this meeting and the affairs of the attendees, or dinner guests, therein. He did so easily enough, and no one stopped him, no, as he was a welcome guest of the Rocumulus family. Still, Refo kept his eyes on him from moment to moment, as he was someone to keep an eye on. Fourth of the 6, Rubo Lane, who owned the largest coffee distributor and importer of the continent of Undra. This was, of course, of no consequence to Refopral and the Sherwoods Company, but he was someone who was wanted there. Vray Oscuro had wanted him there, after all, as they worked together, the two of them, but the fact of the matter was that he had his own company, Rubo Lane, which acted as an extension of his coffee company. Coffee of Import and Coffee Construction were their names. Simply enough put, it was easy enough for Refo to remember the names, and the man, as he was extremely intelligent and extremely blond. Fifth of the sixth, it did not matter. Rocumulus, Refo's great father, was now speaking, again and now to the most important guest of the night, as far as he was concerned. Grand and Obscurus, the owner of the what one would think is infamous if you listen to Refo, Darkwood's company. And indeed he was intimidating. A large man with a long black beard, Grand and Obscurus stood at least a head taller than Refo, and more so even than Refo or Rocumulus. But Refo, in response to his obvious stature, kept it extremely calm. Almost as calm as Refo. He knew what threat the man could pose, as was proof of his competent land grabbing, as it were, his purchasing of the wooded area just west of the Shire, which was simply named the Western Forest. It was largely unexplored, the territory, but it had a beginning and it had no end. Or rather, it had an end, but nobody knew exactly where it was. Though there were towns and cities just west of it, the names of which were presently unimportant. Most travelers simply ventured around the large forest. And so, some people did know its end, but others did not. Grand and Obscurus. He was cutting it down. And close to the Shire, very close. Too close, although notably not connected to the woods in the Shire, which expanded to the north a ways. Refo loathed him, the man, Grand and Obscurus, but he hid it well, and he had to, though Refo suspected that Grandin knew this, that Refo felt threatened by him, and of course he did, Refo thought, staring at the statue of a man. Of course, Grandin could see past it. He was shrewd, Refo could tell, and he remained quiet as he listened to Refo, who spoke to him now directly. Grandin, he began with some force. You are my most welcome guest. There was a small pause as Grandin nodded his thanks to give recognition and respect, or the appearance of those qualities, steadfastly to Refo. Refo was, of course, unconvinced, Refo knew. However, one would not have been able to tell just by watching. In fact, he hid them so well, his emotions, Refo Rocumulus, that even Refo, who had always had a keen eye for detecting intention, could detect nothing except a polite welcome where he knew there was only disdain. Refo felt some disgust for his father in that moment, as he wished that he would confront the man, to put him in his respective place, but Refo understood, to the extent that he could understand, what he was doing, what Refo Rocumulus himself was doing. And what was he doing? Refo, sitting upright respectfully, listened intently, waiting and learning from his father. And his father continued his small speech, his small welcome, as every guest listened and remained so, listening. Tell me, said Refo, how did you find yourself in our neck of the woods? Grandin did not immediately respond, but Refo had not expected him to. Instead, Grandin waited a moment to think, and then said quite calmly, I didn't actually. He ceased speaking. Refo took a moment to reply, though he wasn't holding his breath, Refo noted, and as the other guests leaned in ever so slightly to listen with some exception, Refo then did reply. Of course not, Refo smiled. He spoke calmly. You are in the Western Forest, unexplored territory. I wonder, he paused a moment. Would you mind telling us about that? How are the trees, and is the cutting going well for you there? Grandin took a breath, smiled briefly, and then leaned back in his chair. Although he appeared the part, his face, etched with many lines and wrinkles, did give away his previous lower position. Perhaps even he did much of the cutting himself, Refo thought, though he could not be certain. He was approximately 40, maybe 45 years old, and so his age obscured much of this information for Refo, so as to make it not so readily available to him. It could be simply that he was getting older, or, well, Refo continued to listen, as did most of the others with the exception of Ray, who hadn't stopped eating the food since he'd sat down. He must have loved chicken, Refo thought to himself momentarily. As well, Beatrice, who of course wanted nothing more than to be taken seriously, did herself begin to struggle to pay attention. Perhaps partially for her age, partially for her pride, and partially for her riches, she did not care of such matters. In any case, she was trying, Refo noted, to stay interested. The others, however, especially those with less inheritance and with more conflicting interests, continued to listen as Grandin proceeded. It is, he said. I find myself well there. That was interesting to say, or so Refo thought. To find himself there, he continued. In fact, said Grandin, I found much there. This piqued Refo's curiosity, and of course he asked what it was he had found. Grandin, of course, said this. Nothing as important as the trees, he smiled curtly, ending the conversation. Refo nodded, and Refo was uncertain as to what that might mean, or as to why his father did not press for more information, but suddenly Refo, he felt that he knew.